Pre-calculus chapter P, or prerequisite chapter, looking at lesson 6, and we're looking at complex numbers, and we discussed those in the previous video. And the next 3 videos are going to discuss how to do algebraic operations with these: add, subtract, multiply, and divide. So this video we are going to look at how to add and subtract complex numbers. And really, adding complex numbers is not any more difficult than adding like terms. So if you know how to add like terms, this should be fairly simple to you. You simply, when adding or subtracting actually complex numbers, you simply take the real part, add it to the real part because they're like terms, and add imaginary to imaginary because they're like terms. Now, they're not separate terms because these are complex numbers, but I'm just using that as trying to connect it to something you've already done before. 7 and 4 are the real parts. They're like terms. I can't add 7 and 3i because they're not like terms. Okay, so simply add 7 and 4, which is 11, and then negative 3 and 5 is positive 2. So we add the, sorry about that, we add the real part to the real part, 7 and 4. We add the imaginary to the imaginary, negative 3 and 5, and we have our answer 11 plus 2i. And again, when we're doing subtracting complex numbers, it's no more complicated than that. It's still adding the real part to the real part, the imaginary to the imaginary part, but this is where you'll make most of your mistakes, if you're going to make any, and it's simply because of that dastardly negative sign that seems to cause so many problems. We have to remember that this minus sign is going to both the 8 and the 3. And what I like to do when I'm doing these is to simply take the real part and walk my way across the problem like this. So I go 2 minus 8. So I keep the negative sign, so that's 2 minus the other real part, 8, so that's negative 6. And then I have and then I do the imaginary part. So here I have negative I minus 3i. Okay, so then that gives me negative 4i, so I have my answer of negative 6 minus 4i. So really the only thing you have to be careful about is making sure this minus sign goes to both numbers, or both parts of the complex number, and notice that this will always change the sign there, so be careful of those. I'm going to give you a few examples here. I'm going to pull down an example here. Let's pause it here for a moment. You can pause the video if you'd like, try it on your own, and then I'll slide it across and you can see the answer right there to that problem. Now I'm going to do another one. There's one in here that's kind of complicated, so I want you to keep watching, and I'll show you how and help you walk you through it. And it's this one right here. It looks all convoluted. It's not in the standard form. You've got the imaginary part first, you've got the real part second, you've got an I squared, and you got an I cubed. And if we're thinking about these in terms of like terms, I squared and I cubed can't be added together, so it looks like I really can't do this. But if we just don't panic and keep in mind what we want to do and some of the things that we already know, we can simplify this and make it into something we can work with. So I'm going to look at the imaginary part first here, because this comes first. So this is I squared, and then it's minus I cubed. Now these are not like terms, so I cannot add them. However, I can take what I know about imaginary numbers and about the letter I and what it represents, and I can simplify this. You remember from previous video that I squared is actually equal to what? Negative 1. So I squared is actually a real part, so I'm actually going to add that to these other real parts later on. Okay, now I have negative I cubed, and again what I need to remember here is some previous algebra skills, meaning I cubed is actually I times I times I. And we also know that 2 i's together is I squared. And what do we know that I squared is? I squared is negative 1. So I can take these 2 i's, make them I squared, which actually reduces or simplifies to negative 1. I then have this 1 I left, so I cubed actually simplifies to negative 1 I. So this is going to be minus negative 1i or negative I. So what's minus minus? That's a plus. So this actually ends up being a positive 1i or positive I. So while they weren't able to be added in their form that was given, by simplifying and applying some things that I know, basically I squared is equal to negative 1. We're able to simplify that into something that we can handle, and then we can go ahead and add. Now again, you have to be careful of this minus sign. Don't forget, this minus sign is this minus sign. This minus sign that's with the I comes from simplifying this, so don't lose those as you're working through that. So that takes care of the imaginary part. I then have the real part here, 3 minus 7, but then I also have this that became a real part when I simplified it, so I have another real part here, negative 1. So that gives me 3 minus 8, so that actually ends up being negative 5. So the answer to this then actually ends up being negative 5 plus I. Negative 5, the real part, plus I, the imaginary part. Okay? So one more example for you to look at. That should be pretty simple. Add the real to the real, the imaginary to the imaginary, and there you have some examples. Okay? So if you had trouble with this one, go back, try to work it on your own and see if you can't come up with the same answer.